The year was 1219, and in the rolling steppes of Central Asia, something unprecedented was happening within the ranks of the most feared military force the world had ever seen. Mongol warriors, men who had witnessed the systematic destruction of entire civilizations, who had built towers from human skulls without flinching, were beginning to question their own commanders. Not because of weakness or cowardice, but because what they were being ordered to do to prisoners had crossed a line that even these hardened killers found difficult to stomach. These were soldiers who had grown up believing that mercy was a luxury their people could not afford. They had been taught that enemies existed only to be crushed, that resistance deserved nothing but annihilation, yet something was stirring in their ranks, a discomfort that would eventually force even Genghis Khan himself to intervene. What could possibly shock an army that had already perfected the art of psychological warfare and mass execution? The answer lies buried in military records that commanders tried to suppress, in whispered accounts that survived in the oral traditions of conquered peoples, and in the testimonies of soldiers who eventually broke their silence. Because what happened to prisoners under certain Mongol commanders wasn't just brutal. It was something else entirely. Something that challenged the very foundations of military discipline and pushed seasoned warriors to the edge of mutiny. Today, we're diving into the darkest chapters of Mongol military history, where the line between strategic terror and pure sadism became so blurred that it threatened to tear apart the most effective war machine in human history. This isn't just about the fall of cities or the collapse of empires. This is about what happens when unlimited power meets human creativity at its most twisted, and how even the most brutal soldiers in history had their limits. The Mongol military machine was built on a foundation of absolute efficiency and calculated cruelty. Every action, no matter how savage it appeared to outsiders, served a strategic purpose. Public executions were designed to terrorize future enemies into surrender. The systematic destruction of cities sent clear messages about the cost of resistance. Even the most horrific displays of violence were, in their twisted logic, tools of warfare rather than expressions of random brutality. But by the early 13th century, as the Mongol Empire expanded beyond the steppes and began encountering more sophisticated civilizations, some commanders began to develop methods that served no strategic purpose whatsoever. These were innovations born not from military necessity, but from something far more disturbing. A fascination with suffering for its own sake, a desire to push the boundaries of human endurance, not to send messages to future enemies, but simply to see how far they could go. General Jebe, one of Genghis Khan's most trusted commanders, was among the first to notice this troubling development. His own troops, veterans of dozens of campaigns, began approaching him with concerns about orders they were receiving from certain regional commanders. These weren't complaints about the harshness of warfare. These were experienced soldiers expressing genuine confusion about instructions that seemed to serve no military purpose beyond the satisfaction of watching people suffer. The first documented case occurred during the siege of Otrar in 1219, where a commander known in Mongol records only as the Experimenter began implementing what he called enhanced interrogation protocols for captured enemy officers. The standard Mongol approach to extracting information from prisoners was straightforward and brutally effective. Torture was applied systematically until the desired information was obtained. Then the prisoner was executed quickly to prevent them from becoming a burden on the advancing army. But the experimenter had different ideas. He began developing elaborate procedures that stretched the process of extracting information over days or even weeks, not because the information was particularly valuable or difficult to obtain, but because he claimed he was studying human responses to prolonged stress. His methods involved a combination of physical torture, psychological manipulation, and what can only be described as medical experimentation. Prisoners were kept alive far longer than military necessity required, subjected to increasingly creative forms of abuse that served no intelligence-gathering purpose. The experimenter would document their responses, noting how different techniques affected their willingness to cooperate, their mental state, and their physical condition. He claimed this research would improve future interrogation efforts, but soldiers who witnessed these sessions reported something very different. What they saw was a man who had become fascinated with the mechanics of human suffering, who treated prisoners not as sources of information, but as subjects for his own twisted curiosity. The sessions would continue long after all useful intelligence had been extracted, long after any strategic purpose had been served. Prisoners would be kept conscious and aware while subjected to procedures that seemed designed primarily to satisfy the experimenter's desire to explore the limits of human endurance. The soldiers' discomfort grew as reports of these activities spread throughout the army. These were men who had participated in the systematic slaughter of entire populations without hesitation, who had carried out orders to execute prisoners by the thousands when supplies were running low. But there was something different about watching a single prisoner being subjected to weeks of carefully planned abuse for no apparent military purpose. One veteran sergeant, a man who had served in the Mongol army since the unification of the tribes, later described the atmosphere in his unit after witnessing one of the experimenters' sessions. He said his men, warriors who had never questioned an order in their lives, began asking why they were being ordered to participate in activities that seemed to serve no purpose beyond entertainment. They understood the necessity of harsh measures during warfare, but they struggled to understand why those measures needed to be prolonged and elaborated upon when no strategic benefit could be identified. The psychological impact on the soldiers themselves became a growing concern for field commanders. Men who had carried out mass executions without showing emotion were beginning to display signs of what we might now recognize as trauma responses after participating in the experimenters' sessions. Sleep disturbances, loss of appetite, and unusual reluctance to follow certain types of orders began affecting unit cohesion and combat effectiveness. Reports of these incidents eventually reached the attention of Subutai, one of Genghis Khan's most trusted generals, and a man known for his strategic brilliance rather than unnecessary cruelty. Subutai understood that the Mongol army's effectiveness depended not just on its tactical superiority, but on the psychological conditioning of its soldiers. Warriors needed to be able to carry out harsh orders without hesitation, but they also needed to maintain the mental discipline required for complex military operations. What concerned Subutai most was not the cruelty itself, but the apparent purposelessness of it. The Mongol military doctrine was built on the principle that every action should serve the ultimate goal of conquest and control. Violence was a tool, like a sword or a bow, to be used when it served strategic objectives. But what the experimenter was doing seemed to treat violence as an end in itself, a form of entertainment that distracted from military objectives and undermined unit discipline. The general began conducting quiet investigations into similar reports from other units, and what he discovered troubled him deeply. The experimenter was not an isolated case. Across the expanding empire, other commanders had begun developing their own variations on standard Mongol practices, elaborating on basic techniques in ways that served no clear military purpose, but satisfied some personal fascination with inflicting suffering. One commander in the Western Territories had begun what he called artistic executions, claiming that the manner of a prisoner's death could be used to send more sophisticated messages to enemy populations. Instead of the quick, efficient executions that had proven effective in terrorizing enemy cities into surrender, he developed elaborate procedures that could take hours or days to complete. He argued that these displays would be more memorable and therefore more effective as deterrents. But soldiers who participated in these executions reported something different. They described a commander who seemed more interested in perfecting his techniques than in achieving military objectives, who would spend hours planning the details of an execution that could have been completed in minutes. The strategic justification seemed to be an afterthought, a way of rationalizing behavior that appeared to be motivated by personal satisfaction rather than military necessity. Another commander in the northern campaigns had developed what he called progressive interrogation. a system that subjected prisoners to increasingly severe torture, not because they were withholding information, but because he believed that different levels of stress would reveal different types of intelligence. Prisoners who had already provided all the information they possessed would be subjected to escalating abuse based on the theory that extreme distress might unlock memories or insights they didn't know they had. The soldiers ordered to carry out these procedures found themselves in an impossible position. They had been trained to follow orders without question, to trust that their commanders understood the strategic necessities of warfare better than they did. But they were increasingly being asked to participate in activities that seemed to serve no purpose beyond satisfying their commanders' curiosity about human suffering. The breaking point came during the siege of Samarkand, when multiple units began reporting incidents of soldiers refusing direct orders for the first time in the history of the Mongol army. These weren't acts of cowardice or insubordination in the face of danger. These were veteran warriors, men with proven records of courage and loyalty, who were beginning to question whether certain orders served any legitimate military purpose. The crisis threatened to undermine the entire command structure that had made the Mongol army so effective. If soldiers began questioning orders, if the absolute obedience that enabled rapid tactical maneuvers started to break down, the military advantages that had enabled a relatively small population to conquer vast territories would be lost. Something had to be done, and the solution would come from the very top of the Mongol hierarchy. But before we explore how Genghis Khan himself intervened to address this crisis, we need to understand exactly what these commanders were doing that could shock an army already notorious for its brutality, because the specific techniques they developed went beyond simple cruelty and entered territory that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of warfare itself. The techniques that began emerging in Mongol camps during this period represented something entirely new in the history of warfare. These weren't innovations designed to extract information more efficiently or to create more effective psychological weapons against enemy populations. These were methods that seemed to exist purely for the satisfaction of those implementing them. Elaborate procedures that transformed the practical business of dealing with prisoners into something resembling twisted entertainment. Commander Yesugei, operating in the conquered territories of Khwarezmia, had developed what his soldiers privately called the collection. Unlike traditional Mongol practice, which focused on quick extraction of useful intelligence followed by efficient disposal of prisoners, Yesugei began maintaining a rotating group of captives for what he claimed were ongoing strategic studies. These prisoners, typically enemy officers or wealthy merchants who might possess valuable information, were kept alive for weeks or months in conditions that defied all military logic. The commander had constructed a series of specialized holding areas where different experimental techniques could be applied simultaneously. One section housed prisoners subjected to sensory deprivation, kept in absolute darkness and silence for extended periods, to study how isolation affected their willingness to cooperate. Another area featured prisoners exposed to constant noise and light, preventing sleep while subjecting them to repetitive questioning designed to break down their mental defenses over time. But what disturbed Yesugei's soldiers most was the meticulous documentation he required. Every session was recorded in detailed logs, noting the prisoner's physical condition, emotional state, and responses to various stimuli. Soldiers were ordered to observe and report on subtle changes in behavior, to measure how long different techniques took to produce desired effects, and to experiment with combinations of methods to see which produced the most interesting results. The military value of these activities was questionable at best. Most prisoners had already provided whatever useful information they possessed within the first few days of capture, following standard Mongol interrogation procedures that had proven effective for decades. Yet Yesugei insisted on continuing his experiments long after any strategic purpose had been served, claiming that his research would revolutionize future intelligence-gathering operations. What his soldiers witnessed, however, was something very different. They saw prisoners who had already been broken, who had already revealed everything they knew, being subjected to increasingly elaborate procedures that served no apparent purpose beyond satisfying their commander's fascination with human responses to extreme stress. The sessions became performances, carefully choreographed displays, where the commander would demonstrate new techniques to his officers while explaining the theoretical principles behind each method. Even more troubling was Yasuge's practice of inviting other commanders to observe his work. These demonstrations became social events, gatherings where military leaders would discuss the finer points of psychological manipulation, while prisoners were subjected to various experimental procedures for their entertainment. The commander presented these sessions as educational opportunities, chances for other officers to learn advanced interrogation techniques that could improve their own operations. But soldiers who attended these demonstrations reported a very different atmosphere. They described rooms filled with laughter and casual conversation, while human beings were systematically degraded for no apparent military purpose. Officers would place wagers on how long prisoners could endure specific procedures, debate the relative effectiveness of different techniques, and suggest modifications that might produce more interesting results. The psychological impact on the soldiers forced to participate in these activities was severe and immediate. Men who had carried out mass executions without hesitation began showing signs of mental distress after spending weeks or months implementing Yasuge's experimental protocols. They had been trained to view enemies as obstacles to be removed efficiently, but they were now being asked to treat human beings as objects of scientific curiosity, subjects to be studied and manipulated over extended periods. Unit cohesion began to deteriorate as soldiers struggled with orders that seemed to contradict everything they had been taught about military efficiency and strategic thinking. The Mongol army had always prided itself on its practical approach to warfare, its ability to achieve maximum results with minimum effort and resources. But these new procedures required enormous investments of time, personnel, and materials while producing no apparent benefit to ongoing military operations. Reports from other regions revealed similar developments. Commander Jelmy, operating in the Caucasus region, had begun what he called comparative studies, where prisoners from different ethnic groups and social backgrounds were subjected to identical procedures to determine whether cultural differences affected their responses to torture. He maintained detailed records comparing how Persian merchants, Armenian craftsmen, and Georgian nobles reacted to various forms of abuse, claiming this research would help tailor future interrogation techniques to specific populations. The soldiers assigned to Jelmy's operations found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having to treat prisoners not as individuals, but as representatives of broader categories, subjects in experiments designed to test theories about racial and cultural differences in pain tolerance and psychological resilience. They were ordered to apply standardized procedures while carefully observing and recording any variations in response that might be attributed to the prisoners' ethnic or social backgrounds. These activities required soldiers to maintain detailed documentation, measuring reaction times, recording verbal responses, and noting physical changes over extended periods. The work was time-consuming and psychologically demanding, requiring sustained attention to human suffering that served no clear military purpose. Many soldiers began to question whether their time and energy might be better spent on activities that actually contributed to ongoing military campaigns. The situation became even more complex when these experimental programs began to interfere with standard military operations. Yasuge's collection required significant resources to maintain, including food, water, medical attention to keep prisoners alive for extended periods, and personnel to monitor and document their condition. These resources were being diverted from frontline units that needed supplies for actual combat operations. Similarly, Jelmy's comparative studies required specialized facilities and equipment that had to be transported and maintained as his forces moved through conquered territories. The logistics of maintaining these experimental programs created additional burdens for supply units that were already struggling to support rapid military advances across vast distances. Field commanders began reporting conflicts between the demands of these experimental programs and the practical requirements of military campaigns. Soldiers assigned to monitoring prisoners were unavailable for combat duties. Resources needed for maintaining experimental facilities couldn't be used to support advancing armies, and the psychological stress affecting personnel involved in these activities was beginning to impact overall unit effectiveness. The crisis deepened when reports reached Genghis Khan's inner circle, describing incidents where soldiers had refused direct orders for the first time in Mongol military history. These weren't acts of cowardice or disloyalty, but expressions of genuine confusion about orders that seemed to contradict fundamental principles of military efficiency and strategic thinking. Veteran sergeants, men who had served loyally through decades of campaigns, were approaching their immediate superiors with questions about the military value of activities they were being ordered to perform. They understood the necessity of harsh measures during warfare, but they struggled to understand why those measures needed to be prolonged and elaborated upon when no strategic benefit could be identified. The situation was particularly problematic because these questions were coming from the army's most experienced and reliable personnel. These weren't new recruits who might lack understanding of military necessities, but seasoned warriors who had proven their courage and dedication in countless battles. Their concerns couldn't be dismissed as weakness or inexperience, and their growing reluctance to participate in certain activities threatened to spread throughout the ranks. More troubling still were reports of soldiers beginning to suffer what we might now recognize as psychological casualties from their participation in these experimental programs. Men who had witnessed the destruction of entire cities without showing emotion were developing sleep disorders, loss of appetite, and unusual behavioral patterns after spending extended periods implementing these new interrogation techniques. The army's effectiveness had always depended on the psychological conditioning of its soldiers, their ability to carry out harsh orders without hesitation while maintaining the mental discipline required for complex military operations. But the experimental programs being implemented by certain commanders seemed to be undermining this conditioning, creating psychological stress that interfered with soldiers' ability to function effectively in combat situations. Unit commanders began reporting decreased morale, increased disciplinary problems, and reduced combat effectiveness among soldiers who had participated in these experimental activities. The very programs that were supposed to improve military capabilities were actually degrading the army's operational readiness, creating problems that threatened to undermine the strategic advantages that had made Mongol conquests possible. The irony was not lost on experienced military leaders. The Mongol army had achieved unprecedented success by focusing relentlessly on practical results, by developing and implementing techniques that maximized military effectiveness while minimizing unnecessary complications. But these new experimental programs seemed to prioritize intellectual curiosity and personal satisfaction over strategic objectives, introducing complications that interfered with rather than enhanced military operations. As reports of these activities continued to reach higher levels of command, it became clear that intervention would be necessary to prevent the complete breakdown of military discipline and effectiveness. The question was not whether action needed to be taken, but what form that action should take and who would be responsible for implementing it. The answer would come from the very pinnacle of Mongol power, from a leader who understood better than anyone else the delicate balance between necessary brutality and counterproductive excess. But first, the full extent of what these commanders had been doing needed to be understood, because the techniques they had developed went beyond anything that had been seen before in the history of warfare. In the history of warfare, the crisis that was brewing within the Mongol ranks reached its most dangerous point when intelligence reports began arriving from multiple fronts describing what could only be called systematic rebellion against direct orders. These weren't isolated incidents of battlefield hesitation or momentary lapses in discipline. These were coordinated refusals by entire units to participate in activities that their commanders insisted were essential military operations. The breaking point came during the occupation of Merv, where Commander Subutai received a delegation of his most trusted officers, requesting what they called clarification of strategic objectives. These were men who had followed him through impossible campaigns, who had never questioned his judgment, even when facing overwhelming odds. Now they stood before him, asking why their soldiers were being ordered to participate in procedures that seemed designed purely to prolong human suffering without achieving any identifiable military goal. The officers presented their concerns with military precision, documenting specific instances where resources had been diverted from combat operations to support what they diplomatically termed extended interrogation protocols. They had compiled detailed reports showing how these activities were affecting unit morale, combat readiness, and overall operational efficiency. Their message was clear, without being insubordinate. Something fundamental had changed in how certain commanders were approaching the treatment of prisoners, and that change was threatening the very foundations of military discipline. What made their concerns particularly compelling was the evidence they presented of declining effectiveness among units involved in these experimental programs. Soldiers who had previously been reliable and efficient were showing signs of psychological distress that interfered with their ability to perform standard military duties. Combat units that had once moved with clockwork precision were becoming hesitant and unreliable when given certain types of orders. Subutai understood immediately that this crisis threatened everything the Mongol military machine had accomplished. The army's success had always depended on absolute trust between commanders and their subordinates, on the understanding that every order served a strategic purpose, even when that purpose wasn't immediately apparent to individual soldiers. But that trust was being eroded by commanders who seemed more interested in satisfying personal curiosities than achieving military objectives. The general's investigation revealed the full scope of the problem. Across the empire, regional commanders had begun developing increasingly elaborate methods for dealing with prisoners that bore little resemblance to traditional Mongol practices. These weren't innovations designed to improve military effectiveness, but personal projects that transformed the practical business of warfare into something resembling entertainment for their creators. Commander Batu, operating in the conquered territories of Georgia, had established what he called the workshop, a facility where prisoners were subjected to what he described as stress testing, designed to determine the breaking points of different personality types. He had developed a complex classification system that categorized prisoners based on their social background, profession, and apparent psychological characteristics, then subjected each category to different experimental procedures to study their responses. The workshop contained multiple chambers, each designed for specific types of psychological manipulation. One room was kept at extreme temperatures, alternating between scorching heat and bitter cold, to study how physical discomfort affected mental state. Another featured carefully controlled lighting that shifted unpredictably between blinding brightness and complete darkness, designed to disrupt normal sleep patterns and create disorientation. But what distinguished Batu's operation from standard military interrogation was its duration and complexity. Prisoners were kept for months rather than days, subjected to carefully planned sequences of procedures that built upon each other in ways that seemed designed primarily to test the commander's theories about human psychology, rather than extract useful intelligence. The entire operation required detailed record keeping, with soldiers ordered to document every aspect of prisoner behavior for analysis and comparison. The psychological impact on Batu's soldiers was severe and immediate. Men who had participated in the systematic destruction of entire cities without hesitation were developing what their officers described as battle fatigue after spending weeks implementing these experimental protocols. They had been trained to view combat as a series of practical problems to be solved efficiently, but they were now being asked to treat human suffering as a subject for scientific study. Unit commanders reported increasing difficulty maintaining discipline among soldiers assigned to the workshop. Men who had never questioned orders were beginning to request transfers to frontline combat units, claiming they preferred facing enemy armies to participating in what they privately called the games. The activities required such sustained attention to human misery that even hardened warriors found themselves unable to sleep or eat normally after extended exposure. Similar reports were arriving from other regions where commanders had established their own experimental programs. The pattern was consistent: elaborate procedures that served no apparent strategic purpose, detailed documentation requirements that diverted resources from military operations, and psychological stress among participating soldiers that threatened unit cohesion and combat effectiveness. The situation became even more troubling when Subbutai's agents discovered that some commanders were actually competing with each other to develop the most innovative techniques. They were sharing information about their methods, comparing results, and attempting to refine their procedures based on feedback from colleagues engaged in similar activities. What had begun as isolated incidents of excessive cruelty had evolved into a systematic program of experimentation that was spreading throughout the command structure. This competitive aspect introduced an entirely new dynamic that further removed these activities from any legitimate military purpose. Commanders were no longer simply implementing harsh but necessary measures to achieve strategic objectives. They were engaging in what could only be described as intellectual exercises, using prisoners as subjects in elaborate experiments designed primarily to demonstrate their creativity and sophistication to their peers. The documentation requirements alone were consuming enormous resources. Soldiers were being assigned to maintain detailed records of prisoner responses, to measure and catalogue physical and psychological changes over time, and to compile comparative analyses of different techniques and their effectiveness. This paperwork was being produced in multiple copies and distributed to other commanders, creating a bureaucratic apparatus devoted entirely to documenting and analyzing human suffering. Even more disturbing were reports that some commanders were beginning to treat these experimental programs as educational opportunities for their subordinates. Young officers were being required to observe and participate in these activities as part of their training, with the claim that exposure to advanced interrogation techniques would make them more effective military leaders in future campaigns. The result was a generation of Mongol officers whose understanding of warfare was being shaped by procedures that prioritized psychological manipulation and extended torture over the practical efficiency that had made their army so successful. These officers were learning to view prisoners not as sources of information or obstacles to be removed, but as subjects for experimentation and analysis. This educational aspect of the problem particularly concerned Genghis Khan's senior advisors when reports finally reached the highest levels of command. The Mongol Empire's continued expansion depended on maintaining military traditions that had proven effective over decades of conquest. But these experimental programs were introducing ideas and practices that contradicted fundamental principles of Mongol warfare. The empire's military doctrine had always emphasized speed, efficiency, and practical results. Armies moved quickly across vast distances, struck hard at enemy weak points, and achieved maximum psychological impact with minimum expenditure of resources. But these new experimental programs required extended periods of static operation, enormous investments of personnel and materials, and complex administrative procedures that interfered with rapid military movement. More troubling still was the effect these programs were having on the army's reputation among potential enemies. The Mongol military machine had always relied heavily on psychological warfare, on the understanding that their reputation for swift and decisive action would encourage enemy cities to surrender without resistance. But reports of these experimental programs were creating a different kind of fear, one that might actually encourage desperate resistance rather than practical surrender. Enemy populations who heard about the extended torture programs being implemented by certain Mongol commanders might conclude that surrender offered no real protection from suffering, that they might as well fight to the death rather than face months or years of systematic abuse. This could undermine one of the army's most effective strategic advantages, its ability to conquer territories without having to fight costly battles for every city and fortress. The intelligence network that Genghis Khan had established to monitor his own commanders began providing increasingly urgent reports about the scope and implications of these experimental programs. Field agents described a military culture that was diverging dangerously from established traditions, where personal innovation was being valued over proven effectiveness, and individual commanders were developing their own approaches to warfare without regard for overall strategic coherence. By the time these reports reached Genghis Khan himself, the situation had evolved from a series of isolated disciplinary problems into a fundamental challenge to the entire command structure that had made Mongol conquests possible. The Great Khan understood that immediate and decisive action would be necessary to prevent the complete breakdown of military discipline and effectiveness. But the solution would require more than simple punishment or policy changes. The experimental programs had become so widespread and so deeply embedded in certain command structures that rooting them out would require a comprehensive reorganization of military leadership and a clear restatement of fundamental principles that had somehow been forgotten or ignored. The intervention that followed would become one of the most significant moments in Mongol military history, a decisive action that would reshape how the empire approached the treatment of prisoners and redefine the relationship between military necessity and personal innovation. But before that intervention could take place, the full extent of what these commanders had created needed to be understood and documented. Because what they had built was something unprecedented in the history of warfare, a systematic approach to human suffering that served no strategic purpose, but satisfied some deeper fascination with the mechanics of psychological and physical destruction. What Genghis Khan discovered when these reports reached his attention was something that threatened the very soul of his empire. The Great Khan had built his military machine on a foundation of calculated brutality, yes, but brutality that served clear strategic purposes. Every act of violence, no matter how savage it appeared to outsiders, was designed to advance the ultimate goal of conquest and control. What his commanders had created was something entirely different, something that served no master except their own twisted curiosity. The Khan's response was swift and characteristically decisive. He dispatched his most trusted general, Subutai, to conduct a comprehensive investigation of these experimental programs, with full authority to take whatever measures necessary to restore proper military discipline. What Subutai discovered during his inspection tour was worse than even the most alarming reports had suggested. At Commander Yasuge's facility in Khwarezmia, Subutai found what could only be described as a grotesque parody of military operations. The compound housed dozens of prisoners who had been kept alive for months, not because they possessed valuable information, but because they served as subjects in elaborate experiments that had taken on a life of their own. The detailed documentation requirements had created a bureaucratic nightmare that consumed more resources than many active military campaigns. Soldiers assigned to monitor these experiments had developed their own informal hierarchy based on their willingness to participate in increasingly extreme procedures. Those who showed enthusiasm for the work were promoted to supervisory positions, while soldiers who expressed reluctance were assigned to menial tasks or transferred to other units. This had created a toxic environment where cruelty was rewarded and compassion was seen as a career-limiting weakness. Even more disturbing was the discovery that some of these facilities had begun operating independently of any military chain of command. Commanders had become so absorbed in their experimental programs that they had essentially forgotten about their primary military responsibilities. They were diverting supplies, personnel, and equipment to support their research projects while neglecting the strategic objectives they had been assigned to achieve. Subutai's investigation revealed that entire units had been effectively removed from active military service to support these experimental programs. Experienced soldiers, who should have been participating in conquest campaigns, were instead spending their time implementing elaborate torture procedures that served no identifiable military purpose. This represented a massive waste of human resources at a time when the empire was engaged in multiple simultaneous campaigns across vast territories. The psychological damage to participating soldiers had become so severe that it was affecting military operations far beyond the experimental facilities themselves. Men who had been exposed to these programs were proving unreliable in standard combat situations, showing hesitation when given orders that reminded them of their experiences in the experimental facilities. Unit commanders were reporting decreased effectiveness among veterans who had previously been their most dependable soldiers. But perhaps most troubling was Subutai's discovery that these experimental programs had begun to attract volunteers from outside the military structure. Civilians from conquered territories, individuals with backgrounds in medicine or scholarly pursuits, were requesting permission to participate in or observe these activities. This suggested that the programs had evolved beyond military operations into something resembling academic research, with all the institutional momentum that such programs tend to develop. The commanders themselves had become so invested in their experimental work that they genuinely seemed to believe they were making important contributions to military science. When questioned by Subutai, they presented elaborate theories about psychological manipulation, detailed analyses of cultural differences in pain response, and comprehensive documentation of their findings. They spoke with the enthusiasm of scholars discussing breakthrough research rather than military officers explaining operational procedures. This academic pretension particularly infuriated Genghis Khan when Subutai's reports reached him. The great Khan had always prided himself on the practical nature of Mongol warfare, on their ability to achieve maximum results with minimum complications. The idea that his commanders were treating warfare as an intellectual exercise, that they were more interested in developing theories than winning battles, represented a fundamental betrayal of everything he had worked to create. The Khan's solution was as brutal as it was effective. He ordered the immediate termination of all experimental programs, the execution of commanders who had initiated these activities, and the reassignment of all personnel who had participated in them. But more significantly, he implemented new command structures designed to prevent this kind of deviation from occurring again in the future. Every regional commander was assigned political officers whose primary responsibility was monitoring adherence to established military protocols. These officers reported directly to Genghis Khan's inner circle, bypassing normal command structures to ensure that deviations from approved procedures would be identified and addressed immediately. No commander would be allowed to operate independently of central oversight again. The Khan also implemented strict resource allocation procedures that required detailed justification for any expenditure of personnel or materials that didn't directly support active military campaigns. The elaborate facilities that had been constructed to support experimental programs were dismantled, their resources redirected to frontline units that were engaged in actual conquest operations. Most importantly, Genghis Khan issued what became known as the Prisoner Protocol, a comprehensive set of guidelines that specified exactly how captured enemies were to be treated under different circumstances. These protocols eliminated the ambiguity that had allowed commanders to justify their experimental programs, providing clear procedures for interrogation, execution, and disposal of prisoners that served strategic objectives without unnecessary complications. The implementation of these reforms was swift and decisive. Within months, the experimental programs that had threatened to tear apart Mongol military discipline were completely eliminated. Commanders who had shown excessive enthusiasm for these activities found themselves reassigned to remote outposts or removed from command entirely. The message was clear: personal innovation that interfered with military effectiveness would not be tolerated. The crisis that nearly shattered the most feared army in history serves as a chilling reminder that even the most disciplined military forces can be corrupted when power operates without restraint. What began as strategic brutality designed to conquer empires had devolved into something far more sinister, a systematic exploration of human suffering that served no purpose beyond the twisted curiosity of those who wielded absolute authority over life and death. Genghis Khan's decisive intervention saved his empire from collapse, but the scars of this period would linger in the memories of those who witnessed it. The soldiers who had questioned their commanders, who had risked court-martial rather than participate in meaningless cruelty, proved that even in the darkest chapters of human history, conscience can survive. Their refusal to cross certain lines ultimately preserved the military machine that would go on to create the largest contiguous empire the world has ever seen. The lesson echoes across the centuries with uncomfortable clarity. When unlimited power meets human creativity at its most twisted, the results can shock even those who have dedicated their lives to violence. The Mongol commanders who developed these experimental programs had crossed a line that separated strategic necessity from pure sadism, transforming warfare into entertainment and soldiers into unwilling participants in elaborate displays of cruelty. Today, as we close this dark chapter, we're reminded that the capacity for both extraordinary brutality and unexpected moral courage exists within the same human nature. The warriors who built towers from skulls could still be horrified by purposeless suffering. The commanders who conquered continents could still lose themselves in the intoxication of absolute power. History doesn't repeat, but it echoes. And in these echoes, we find warnings that remain as relevant today as they were 8 centuries ago on the steppes of Central Asia.